The topic for my presentation today is about the applicability of Ronald Ingleher's post-materialist thesis in China. I will be talking about some of the limitations and problems associated with the current research conducted by the existing scholars and researchers on the field of post-materialism and authoritarianism in China. Those type of research, they use survey data as well as public opinion polls to investigate value changes and the differences between values across different regions and cities in China. At the end of my presentation today, I will be talking about some kind of room of improvement for the future researchers in the field to consider about and take into account to raise research questions or to use survey data in their research. On the left-hand side of the slide, I have listed some of the most important research questions that the researchers could ask in this field. The first one is Ingleher's economic thesis about economic prosperity, income, social status, social class, or social grade, as well as industrialization and degree of urbanization. And the second question is about Ingleher's socialization theory, considering the environment where the children grew up, especially about their parents' income and their parents' education. And the third set of questions is about the cultural backlash theory, about authoritarian reflex, flat into security, authoritarian personality, as well as this association between authoritarianism and conservatism. And we could also talk about life cycle effects or short-term fluctuations given the scenarios or case studies within a generation's lifetime. And importantly, some comparative political research can be conducted, such as between mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. According to my own literature review, we could identify some of the challenges and limitations when we address those research questions in the current literature. We could accordingly identify some of the problems and limitations related to Chinese survey project datasets and also the current Chinese post-materialism and authoritarianism research. And importantly, we could probably look at the differences and inconsistencies of the definitions and operationalizations of post-materialism and authoritarianism between Asia and the West. When we look at the limitations of Chinese post-materialist research, we could probably identify 7 different sets of limitations. The first limitation is that it seems to me there is no well-justified or well-defined distinction between post-materialism and liberalism when the researchers address survey data and public opinion data. In other words, while there is a more consistent and coherent agreement on the definition of liberalism applied in survey designs across scholars, it seems that there has not been a consistent conceptualization of post-materialism yet. And very importantly, for research that has based on the CGSS, the Chinese General Social Survey, the survey components may not have covered and mirrored all the essential issues that categorize post-materialism as defined by Ingleher. Therefore, by selecting different questionnaire questions from CGSS or from WVS for China may yield different research results. And according to my own literature review, there are disagreements between research results from regional, city level, and individual or national level samples, so that different results could be concluded when we look at data from different levels in China. And also, I found a research that looks at the objective social status and the subjective social status, and when we distinguish between the two, different research results can be yielded. In other words, it seems that there are no very clear cutting lines between the labor class, the middle class, or the upper class. And due to the difficulties and complexities in post-materialist research, I have not found very prominent or promising comparative studies across provinces and different regions in China. And many studies do not explicitly and clearly specify to what extent their research cover, whether it covers the whole Greater China area, or it excludes Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. In other words, by only looking at and analyzing a small number of cases in China, such as cities or regions, we cannot make very reliable conclusions about post-materialism across whole China. When we look at the limitations of Chinese authoritarianism research, we can also see that, similar to post-materialism research, there are also some shortages that are implied in those current research. When we look at the research on authoritarianism conducted in North America and Europe, we sometimes see their analysis on the correlation or association between authoritarian values and political ideologies. We sometimes see this connection between authoritarian values and conservative values, or authoritarian values and right-wing political ideologies. However, such connections cannot be made in the analysis in the literature of China, not only because China is a one-party system, but also that some domestic survey projects, such as CGSS, are quite limited in terms of asking a range of different questions. And while Inglehart identified this recent authoritarian reflex, as what he called it, in China, we cannot identify this authoritarian reflex, and we do not see this correlation between populism and authoritarianism. And lastly, some researchers and thinkers in China address the Chinese authoritarian orientation from a philosophical point of view, whereas the Western definition of authoritarian personality is based on empirical understandings. When many researchers talk about authoritarianism in China, they talk about different types of Confucian and traditional values that are associated with the current society. Whereas in the Western context, we talk about different personal traits that are associated and observed in authoritarianism research across different regions. And after that, I will be moving on to talk about specifically the limitations associated with the Chinese General Social Survey, the CGSS. First of all, the project was launched in 2003, so that its data is only available after 2003. So some longitudinal observations or observations about generational replacements are not possible, solely using this CGSS data. And if you go to the website of CGSS, you could figure out that its access, use, and download are quite restrictive for the domestic as well as foreign ordinary scholars and researchers. And lastly, and most importantly, its implementation is still largely through face-to-face interviews or field trips. And only recent years, it has switched to a more computerized mode to collect responses from respondents. There are two problems with the face-to-face interviews or field trips. One is the social desirability bias, where the respondents only give socially desirable answers to the investigators instead of talking honestly about their situations or beliefs. And secondly, it is about convenience sampling. In some of the rural areas, it is probably hard for the local investigators to find enough respondents, so they only find their friends and people that are easily reached out to give responses. Then there is a representation bias based on this convenience sampling. Another problem with CGSS is that it does not cover data in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Tibet, and some other politically sensitive districts. So the results concluded from CGSS may not be so representative of whole mainland China or the Greater China area. And the last two problems, one is that the survey itself is subject to political censorship and some degree of political manipulation. And lastly, the social trust issue in mainland China tends to have some kind of implications on the respondents' behavior, such as whether they answer honestly or they are willing to take those questionnaires in the first place. Some of the drawbacks I've mentioned here about CGSS may also represent some problems in other domestic surveys about public opinion and political beliefs in China. After talking about the problems and limitations regarding post-materialism and authoritarianism research in China, I'll be moving on to talk about how researchers in the future might apply Ronald Ingleher's thesis in the context of China, and what types of research questions can actually be raised and analyzed in the context of the Greater China area. One very important point that we have to keep in mind is that we not only need individual level data on post-materialism and authoritarianism, we also need city level, regional level, provincial level, and national level data, so that we could compare the different research results, whether they are similar or they are different in terms of the correlation between economic status and post-materialism. Another possible important point for the researchers to consider about and investigate is that if we find a weak association between post-materialism and economic status, can we actually contribute it to Confucianism and the Confucian history of China and the Asian area as a whole? So now let's move on to the last section, which talk about the possible set of research questions that we could ask about post-materialism research in the Greater China area. Firstly, we could talk about the economic prosperity, economic growth, and the degree of industrialization and urbanization with post-materialism on the provincial level. And secondly, we could probably talk about social class, status, and occupation with post-materialism on the individual citizens level. And thirdly, we could also discuss about the childhood early socialization theory, mirrored by the parents' income and education, with post-materialism on the individual families level. And fourthly, we could talk about education, age, and gender, with post-materialism on the individual level. And fifth, we could talk about generational replacements and transformations, as well as the short-term life cycle effects related to post-materialism as well as authoritarianism. We probably could also use observational data from some type of natural experiments, such as a natural disaster or a sudden decline in the economic situation of some of the cities or provinces. And this is actually titled Flight into Security.